At noon the house breathed like an animal in the heat, slow lungs of sun on whitewashed walls, the metal of the cistern paling under glare, the servants' shadows stripped thin across the patio. The big house and the Cenzala kept their own atmospheres, inside gloss and perfume, a careful arrangement of mirrors and polished silver. Outside, the damp and steady work of hands and the smell of earth and smoke. Between those worlds, in the place where the two airs met, Benedita moved like a person who knew the weight of patience as a thing of muscle and bone. Her fingers were small, but they had calluses in places no one admired. She learned early to fold her wrist so the palm could be used without giving away the thought beneath it. When she polished the mistress's silver tankard, she watched the way light fell on the lip and pretended she could smooth the house's sharp edges along with the metal. Old lessons lived in her mouth, as if they were a prayer. Never lower your head, never lower your head, never lower your head. Her mother had said it once so that the phrase settled into the bones, not as an order but as a map. How to keep oneself upright inside a world built to buckle people. Donna Constanza came like a season, full of small rituals and a temper made of lace and steel. She kept a tailor in Salvador on the colonel's account and a dozen dressmaker's scraps in trunks upstairs. She bathed at the same hour each day in a basin set on a stood that had come from Lisbon, preferring the public carefulness of ritual, a woman of house and mirrors who measured the world by the polish on a candlestick. Her vanity was a force field around the house. Everything had to shine to reflect her, and everywhere the servants' work showed was proof of who held the keys. The tankard was one of those proofs. It was not a great fault, only a blurred crescent on the silver where the rag slipped. Benedita had dried the lip twice and set it on the tray with the other pieces. The afternoon light made the tiny smear visible, a thing the mistress's eye seized at once. Donna Constanza's hand was a whip of movement. She seized the tray as if the metal were the work of a servant who thought herself invisible. "Who set this down?" she asked, in the tone used for small animals who had made a mistake. Benedita lifted her eyes. She had been taught to answer with the shape of silence that does not begin in the throat, but in a body ready to take on correction, but something colder than habit had risen inside her. Her mother's voice, quiet and unwinding. "Never lower your head." The phrase steadied her. She said her name plainly. "Benedita, mistress." Donna Constanza's face tightened, a mapped thing where scorn drew lines into new patterns. "This is not the first time you have been careless." The words were a public thing. They were meant to mark and measure, to let everyone on the patio know the line between those who command and those who serve. Behind the mistress, a few of the housewomen gathered, leaning the way leaves lean into a breeze. The Fater Tomas stood by the gate with the look of a man who believed in the rightness of sharpness. The slap came that way, ordered, not blind. A hand flashed out from Donna Constanza and met Benedita's cheek, with a sound like a stick striking a board. The house exhaled. The slap did more than touch skin. It was a performance that the patio understood, an advertisement of authority, a small theatre that taught everyone where to stand. Benedita felt the sting, but more than the pain there was the visible translating of humiliation across the faces around her. A servant's face is always already public property inside a house like that, and the edges of a person get trimmed away by other people's eyes. Benedita stood with her jaw held, with the mother's map under the bones. "Never lower your head. Never lower your head." "Bring her here," said the mistress. Her voice lost its satin. "Teach her to listen." They took her to the center of the patio. The sun sat like a coin on the tiles. Tomas uncoiled a whip with the quiet of a man handling a tool he had used before. The workers and the household joined, not because they desired spectacle, but because the world there prepared for rituals of correction, the way fields prepare for rain. They had been taught to look away and to look as commanded. The house needed witnesses. The whipping was a lesson given in the middle, so the edges of obedience could be traced again. What the whip did to Benedita's body mattered less in the telling than what it did to the house's sound. The lash translated into a rhythm. It cut the afternoon like a metronome. There were small sounds, the slap of leather, the short choked breath that presses behind teeth, a child somewhere in the shade coughing at the noise. Benedita counted the strokes in a way that removed them from being an accident, and made them into a fact she could hold. Each time the cord fell, she felt the air negotiate with the skin and heard her own heart keep time. Between strikes, she tasted metal, not blood so much as the memory of metal, and in those small silences, faces watched her like an object lesson. She kept her head up. Afterward, they led her back to the senzala on little paths that avoided the house's front steps. The women there waited in slow hues of shadow, a ring of bodies who knew how to translate a brokenness into repair. Lucia had her own way of washing hands, firm, exact, like a mechanic whose fingers know where the grease lives. Maria hummed under her breath, a string of melody that softened the edges of the patio's shout. Isabel brought clean cloths and a pot of warm water. They did not speak of revenge. The talk there was of stitches and ointment, of how to bend the body back into work without leaving it too raw to sleep. Benedita let them tend to her, let the cloth cool the hotness where the lashes had made the skin feel as if it had been pressed by a brand. The pain was not the whole thing. The worst part was the watching, how the world calibrated itself back to its old axis. The mistress's voice an easy measure, yet even in the small room under the eaves, the old lesson returned with force. Never lower your head. Her mother's words were not bravado, but a way to name refusal to make oneself small because someone else demanded it. It was also a promise that keeping the head up would create the possibility of seeing things other people wanted kept hidden. That evening, while the house settled into its lamps and the colonel's chest of papers lay beneath a blanket of absence, the women sat with their backs to the wall and spoke low. The patio had tongues. The senzala had memory. They spoke of Donna Constanza's daily routines, the hour of her bath, the path she took across the courtyard when she went to the garden to cut flowers, the way she listened for the sound of a polished spoon. They spoke of Tomas's habits, how he drew the lashes and when he liked his beer, and of the times when the colonel's horses stamped and a rider came through the gate like a rumour. They exchanged small bits of knowledge the way people barter. Who could fetch a hot coal without being seen? Whose nephew worked in the bowels of the kitchen? Which boy could bring a message across the yard unseen? It was in those small mercies that a plan found its shape. They were not foolish. They knew the balance of danger. In the sense of the world they lived in, any act of correction could become a reason to take more, fines of bread, lost rations, beaten bodies, men dragged away for weeks. The Cenzala remembered names of those led out and never returned. Resistance had a cost, yet to circle the house and never name wrongs was a different kind of death, one made of erosion. The women wanted to shape a moment that would be public, that would show the mistress herself vulnerable to a sound she had used to make others small. They wanted, with a small perfection, to make Donna Constanza's vanity fracture in the same place where it had broken Benedita's body. Their tool, a day and water. Water that would be thrown where it would stain the mistress's robe and break the silence of the house. The method would be careful, not reckless. They would manipulate the kitchen's fires so the water would be as hot as a scalding truth. They would time the steps of the maid who usually carried the basin. They would have 2 buckets, the working bucket that seemed to hold ashes, the second that would hold the heat and the gesture. The plan was as much theatre as it was sabotage. The mistress was made to scream in the middle of her own domain. An element of the house turned against its maker. "Heat is everything," Lucia said that night, her hands mapping the plan on the wood table where they sat. "Make the stove mouthless and the kettle will burn. Time it when the mistress wants the bath. She will not suspect a thing." "This is a risky craft," Maria answered. "If Tomas is near, he'll stop the maid. If the colonel returns—" "If the colonel returns," Isabel said, finishing the thought in the way you finish a rope so it will not slip. "We are ready with stories." They drew a map in the ash by the hearth, the path from the kitchen to the mistress's chamber, the place the maid usually rested the second bucket, the nodes where a glance could be given and a door closed. The plan was an assembly of small lies and careful acts. They bent truths until they fitted what they needed, a stove left to smoulder, a maid co-opted with a wink, a boy's loyalty bought with a few coins pulled from a sleeve. Benedita listened more than she spoke. She had been the one struck across the patio. She was the one whose face the mistress would see most clearly in the mornings. She knew the place of shame and the way light met skin. To make Donna Constanza scream would be to split the house's polished front into a visible fissure. The women who had gathered around her did not promise consequence-free outcomes. They told the stories of people who had tried other things and paid a higher price. That honesty did more than scare Benedita. It steadied her. Never lower your head. The phrase was now a juncture. It could be a way of holding out dignity while also making a choice. In the days that followed, they began the small mechanical work that would make the plan possible. A coaling of the stove, timed by Maria, who pretended to catch flies in her palm and then, while everyone looked away, slid in a bit more wood. Lucia practiced holding a bucket, so it did not clink like a kitchen tool but moved like a thing meant for care. Isabel fetched a rag that smelled faintly of lavender and put it where the mistress's maid would find it, a soft manipulation of habit. They taught the maid when to look up and what not to notice. The plan required perfect plainness. A tray, a basin, the ordinary motion of water moved into the right place at the right time. Too theatrical, and the house would smell an intention. Too quiet, and it would be invisible. On the morning they chose, the air itself was a taut thing. The sunlight had a quality like a hush. No wind to make the trees clap their leaves, the slave dogs resting, the colonel's stables asleep. In the house, mirrors reflected a thin white light back into rooms where lace made shadows of ladies' dresses. Donna Constanza walked through her rooms in a gown she had saved for company, a fabric that made the sound of silk. She arranged flowers in vases, adjusted a ribbon, listened for the servant's step she loved because it said things about obedience. Benedita carried 2 buckets, one that smelled faintly of the ash they had put in it, so if anyone peered, the plainness would be convincing. The other one heavy with water the women had heated beyond comfort. She tucked the bucket's lip into the crook of her elbow, the way a person carries an animal against their chest. The water rolled like a secret in the pail. Her heart beat with an old drum of fear and a new hollow of purpose. Never lower your head, she mouthed like a shield passing over her teeth. The house moved like a crowd that didn't want to show its attention. The maid, Clara, who had been taught to look the other way, walked beside Benedita with an empty tray, as if to show the mistress that everything was in order. Tomas lingered by the door with the look of a man waiting for authority to hand him a task. The women who had planned took their places. Lucia lingered by the kitchen door with a face like a stone. Maria pretended to sort cloths in the yard. Halfway across the patio, a hoofbeat cut the air. It was small at first, an animal thing, then it clicked into a rider's rhythm, one of the small absent dangers they had always felt at the back of the plan. A horse's arrival could mean a new voice, an order that would unravel everything. Benedita felt the sharp tilt in her chest, the old map of danger. The rider slowed at the gate. For a moment time gathered in that spot between dawn and the afternoon heat. Benedita thought of the lashes that had fallen a week before, of the way the house expected its music of command to be uninterrupted. She thought of her mother's phrase in a voice that was less a map now and more a kindling. Never lower your head. She took 3 measured steps, testing the rhythm of the ground, so that if the rider called out she could answer in one plain thing, that she carried water, only water, and the mistress would have her bath. The rider dismounted and walked toward the house with purposeful gait. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, dust like a cloak on his shoulders. The colonel's horse bent his head to the grass, careless of manners. Tomas's stance changed. A man arriving in a hat like that could bring the echo of commands, the stamp of orders that made plans hide. Benedita's hands tightened without thinking. Her bucket was suddenly too heavy, the water tending toward a boil in her mind. The mistress appeared at the doorway like a flower unfurling, slow and measured. She smiled at the man who had ridden in. The house's music resumed 2 beats later. Benedita continued, her steps a small drumbeat across the sun-flooded patio. The plan required that the maid lead the basin to the mistress and set it down while Benedita waited just long enough for the moment to be unnoticed. There would be a beat, a small opening, and then the bucket's arc. Moments before metering into action, Benedita saw Tomas look toward the gate. The rider's hat made his presence foreign to the contours they had mapped. Benedita could have stopped. Stopped would mean staying in place, retreating into the familiarity of the Cenzala and letting time wear the wound thinner. But the women's faces had been sewn together by risk. They had made a pact with one another in the currency of small gestures, a look, a nod, a cloth pressed into another's hand. The plan could be ruined in a half-breath. It could also be the hour when the mistress discovered that the house's perfection was brittle. She moved. The throw is quick when it is made by a body that has rehearsed it in the silent rooms of the night. It is quick because indecision slows and the arc becomes a hesitation. Benedita's arm went out in the clean, honest language of someone carrying truth to light. The water left the pail like a silver ribbon. It struck the mistress's gown at the shoulder with a sound like fabric meeting a small storm. Donna Constanza's scream was immediate and terrible in that way. It cut the air as the whip had cut Benedita's skin, but it was of a different order. A human noise dropped out of politeness and into the raw, undeniable place of being exposed. The house, which was made of buffers and mirrors, had no small thing to catch that sound. It ricocheted through rooms, through the high-backed chairs, through the servants' ranks. It landed like a fist on the faces of people who had only ever been asked to look down. For a heartbeat the world held, and then the patio turned its head. The rider's hat bobbed. Tomas swore. A maid gasped. Donna Constanza's hands flew to her gown, palms patting at the wetness as if she could close the world up again by touching it. Her face convulsed between rage and shame. Her voice laughed in a brittle way that was not a laugh at all. "Who—" she began, and the sentence broke into 100 interrupted things. The household's order had been made to creak. Benedita did not stand to savor the sound. There is no space in that moment for triumph. There is only a quickness of motion and the desire to be away from the shape of a scene you have caused. She turned toward the shade, toward the doorways that would swallow her small shape. Around her the women who helped had acted, a cloth tossed toward the mistress's shoulders to dry the stain, a boy to lie about where the bucket had been kept. The plan's choreography became annexed to chaos. Steps were shouted. Commands collided. The house was alive in panic. Yet even amid the clamor, voices in the Cenzala held a hard, muffled sound of exultation. Not for victory. There was nothing that could be called victorious in a place where the next day might bring reprisals, but for the momentary inversion where the mistress had produced the loudest cry and not the whip. The scream itself would travel into stories, become a syllable that would alter how people told the house's tale to their grandchildren. Benedita's breath came fast and clean. The old map in her head pressed against her ribs. Never lower your head. It was there again, not as a shield now, but as a name for what she had done. She had kept her eyes high enough to see the path. She had acted where the world had taught her to be small. The price was not yet counted, and she did not pretend it would be small. In that space between the mistress's scream and Tomas's cry, she felt the hot awareness of consequence. People moved toward her with 100 hands and 100 needs. The maid who had carried the basin whispered at her with a voice the shape of fear. "Go," she said. A boy tucked Benedita's sleeve into his palm and led her to the low doorway that opened to the servant quarters. The world of the house was reorganizing itself, the mistress in her ruined satin, the colonel's hat at the gate, the overseer whose face had become a mask of fury. The patio had been split into two ways of being, public shame and a private readiness to vanish. From the darkness of the corridor, Lucia caught Benedita's wrist for a moment, and in the squeeze sent a message that had no syllables. "Stay with us, or disappear into whatever road you can find." Maria's eyes met Benedita's with a look that asked less for explanation than for iron in her limbs. "Be quick." Isabel took a step that would later be remembered as reckless, standing at the corner as if to block Tomas, though she had nothing but a broom. The first moments after a thing like that are messy. Shouts multiplied, a pot clattered in the kitchen. A child began to cry as if the house's sound had finally touched a place children recognize: unpredictability. Benedita melted between the low bunks of the servants and the coolness of the clay floor. She could hear Donna Constanza demanding punishment in the tones of someone who believed that shouting could reinstate the order of the world. Tomas's voice rose with the promise of reprisal. The saddle scraped on the gate. The horse shifted its weight. That night, the Cenzala folded around its own with a protective hunger. They tended Benedita as if she were both patient and projectile. Her skin had new marks where the whip had landed days before. Her hands trembled, not from the pain, but from the adrenaline of the act she had carried out in public. There was no triumphant song. They spoke low, mapping out possibilities. If the overseer decided that retribution must be instant, they would need to have solutions. If the colonel decided to take offense for his wife's wounded vanity, they would have to consider walks far longer than the patio. They did not sleep well. Windows and doors seemed to shift. Even the dogs were quieter, their musks softened to a low vigilance. Lucia sat by the small stove and reheated a pot, as if by business. Maria counted the cloths, as if perfection could be remade from little things. In the dawn's thin light, the plan that had required water and steel became a rumor. The mistress's scream had cleaved the house into an after, and everyone in the Cenzala felt the new future like a bruise, indelible and tender. At the first murmurs of light, news floated in the form of a knock. A boy from the house came to the servant's door with a voice made small by the weight of what he carried. "The mistress says the colonel will be here this evening," he relayed, as if delivering weather. That phrase landed like a small coldness. The colonel's presence could rewrite consequences into harsher penalties. His authority was not measured in a single person's cruelty, but in a structure that made punishment efficient and contagious. They sat back on their heels, the room collecting the shape of thought. The plan had worked its way into the public house, and the mistress had been made to scream in front of everyone. The echo of that sound would not be easily swallowed. Still, the road that followed could be unforgiving. Benedita felt the truth of the women's earlier warnings as a persistent ache. Outside the Cenzala, the house had other reckonings. Donna Constanza fussed with a clean gown, then tore at it with impatient hands. She would not, could not, let this blemish mark her forever. The colonel's eventual arrival would be a measure of how far the house would be willing to press the blade. Tomas paced like a caged animal, and the household whispered of arrests, fines, punishments, as if the menu of reprisal had infinite pages. In the coolness of the servants' room, Benedita folded her hands and thought of her mother's voice once more. "Never lower your head." She did not know if that phrase had saved her or damned her. She only knew that it had given her a compass for a moment when the house's music was interrupted, and a scream had opened a new kind of listening. She had acted. The sound she had made would travel. How it would be remembered, whose stories would be told and whose would be erased, was a matter for the next hours and the long days to come. When dawn thinly greyed into morning, the women moved with a new carefulness. The house shuddered like an animal roused. Questions would come, and with them the shape of danger. Some would claim Benedita had stolen the mistress's dignity and been made to pay for it. Others would whisper her name like praise, a syllable soft as bread. Neither story would be all of the truth, and both would carve new edges into the lives of those who had acted. For now, the patio buzzed with a different sound. It was not only the echo of a whip or the residue of a cry. It was the knowledge that a small negligence, a smear on a tankard, had moved into a public shame and then morphed into an act of defiance. The house that had expected silence had for the first time in a long time heard itself answer. The sound of Donna Constanza's scream travelled into corners where orders had been long accepted like weather. In those corners, the phrase that had steadied Benedita breathed again, worn but insistently bright. "Never lower your head." They did not yet know what the following days would demand. The colonel might tighten his fist, or he might be swift to forgive in the name of family calm. Tomas might find a scapegoat. Friends could be bought with lesser comforts. The Cenzala could be questioned, scoured, punished by a series of measures that would leave the wounds not always visible. The cost of the scream would be tallied in ways that had nothing to do with the immediate jubilation. For the women who had planned, the price was already present in the tightening around the house. In the way the mistress's eyes now sliced through people as if to find the next small rebellion, in the way the cook's door was watched, in the way the orchard's quiet seemed baited. Benedita rose with the others when the light had fully come to the patio. She carried her hands like someone who had learned the art of holding a secret and the art of giving it away at the right time. The day ahead would be one of questions, of small gestures turned into trials. She had made a sound travel, and the sound had changed things. Whether it would change the long sweep of her life was not hers to claim. She had only the fact that she had acted, and the knowledge that the world now had the knowledge of what could be done. She walked out to the patio to fetch water, because life in a place of work required the continuing of simple things, even when storms were clearly above. The mistress watched her from the veranda, her eyes like small knives. Around her, the house's people kept to their tasks with new carelessness, as if to prove they had not been involved in any extraordinary thing when the extraordinary had occurred. None of them would be so certain. "Never lower your head," Benedita said under her breath as the sun pulled its light across the tiles. The phrase was a small island in the rush of consequence. It was both promise and warning. She did not know the shape of what would come next, only that she had made the mistress scream in front of everyone, and that the act, simple in its means, immense in its echo, had altered the rhythm of the house. No one that afternoon could say yet whether the change would bloom into something lasting or close like a wound. The world held its breath, the colonel's horse at the gate, and Tomas's clenched hands, the mistress's ruined satin, the quieted laughter of the servants. In the Cenzala, hands folded into each other. In the house, mirrors reflected a small crack. The sound had travelled, and where sounds go, stories follow. If you are holding this moment with us, stay. What comes next will change the way this house is remembered. The colonel's horse had not yet cooled its flanks when the rumour reached his ear. He arrived in the manner of men who measure the world by the sound of their boots on a veranda. Slow, deliberate, the hat pulled low as if to shade a temper that expected obedience. He took in the scene with the economy of a man used to a dozen small uprisings being solved by one sentence or one lash. Donna Constanza demanded, with a voice like a cracked bell, that justice be done. Tomas wanted more than justice. He wanted a lesson loud enough to make people forget the sound they had heard. The house answered the colonel as houses do, with explanations and excuses rehearsed like prayers. The mistress pressed her handkerchief between trembling fingers and described the wetness on silk as an affront that could not stand. The fighter's account was short and sharp. Someone had thrown water. There would be a price. Yet even as words of retribution formed on the porch, they bumped against a fact not easily returned to its place. The mistress had screamed. It was a noise that belonged to lack, to vulnerability, to the sudden collapse of an image. That sound defied being brushed away by protocol. Tomas circled the Cenzala like a hawk watching a field. He demanded names and proofs. He wanted to break the chain of complicity and make an example of those who had dared to touch the mistress's satin. The violence he proposed was procedural: arrests, interrogations, a public recantation to shore up dignity. The household's order demanded visible correction so the rhythm of command could continue. For those in the Cenzala, it meant evenings sharpened by worry and days measured against a calendar of possible punishments. They were careful. The Cenzala had always been careful. But care, like courage, has its limits. It carries a weight. On the second day, men came for 2 of the women. The way they were taken was formal and quick. Shouted names, hands bound with strips of cloth, a cart rattling through the yard. Lucia stood with her hands folded, as if she were only waiting for a pot to boil. Maria's mouth made small circles against the air. Isabel tried to step forward and was held by 2 boys who looked at the ground, because looking up might be asking for trouble. The captain of the Mato who led the detentions was a man who made business of fear. He moved like someone who had grown up in another country of law, one that held a trade in returned slaves and in settling debts. He did not lick his lips or boast. His method was steadier. Questions that folded into threats, the rustling of ropes, the clink that makes a promise of punishment audible. He took account of the house's grief and the servant's explanation, and still held others to answer. He claimed he would follow evidence, but evidence in that place sometimes meant a child's cry, a neighbor's suspicion, a man's need to show loyalty to a master. The net he cast would not distinguish between guilt and association. Back in the Cenzala, the women tried to mend what they could. A boiling pot of herbs, a thread of linen to pass under a tongue that had been forced to silence. These were their laws, small and fierce. Benedita kept to the shadow by the stove, her hands more quiet than before, because acts make room for consequence, and consequence demands a shape. The plan that had worked to make the mistress cry had now made a ledger of accounts the women could not erase. There was no glory, only accounting and fear. Never lower your head, her mother had said. Now she felt the phrase as ballast and as burden. It steadied and it exposed, it held promise, and it insisted on sacrifice. That night they came again to ask for those who had aided Benedita's escape. The mistress's voice had found a new instrument, fury sharpened by wounded vanity. Tomas wanted confessions, he wanted names, he wanted to be able to go back into the patio and parade the names of the guilty in numbers, a public accounting that would reassert the rules. People were taken for questioning. A boy who had lied about the buckets, a girl who had been at the kitchen door, a nephew who had run an errand. Some returned with lashes counted on their backs and faces arranged to show contrition. Others did not return at all. The punishments that followed were not all of the same cruelty, but they were all aimed to do a function, to teach, to frighten, to rearrange loyalties. One woman who long ago had helped a neighbor and had always had a soft laugh was made to swear at the gate before the colonel's circle that she had no part. When her voice faltered, the lash bit. Another young man, suspected of carrying messages, was sent to a nearby finca for a season. His absence a deliberate rupture, a lesson to kin that being helpful could mean being sold into the quiet distance beyond the river. Isabel felt the hand of humiliation become a law of daily life. She was set to the back of the house, to the scullion's labor, with no cake at festivals and a watchful eye that made sleep thin. Lucia was made to attend to the colonel's horses with dirt under her nails, a work meant to dull pride. Each measure had a logic aimed at dissuasion. None of them could heal the part of a person that had been asked to bear public shame. The household's official story tightened and rearranged itself. The mistress muttered about the sanctity of the house, about how one might forgive a clumsy hand, but not an intention to bring scandal. The colonel, who had come to the door and stood like a judge without a ledger, weighed the practical against the personal. He could, with a curt word, have made the matter settle. A public apology, a sum of coin, an example put forward. Yet power has its risks. To punish too harshly might turn a scandal into martyrdom, might make the woman who had thrown the water into a symbol beyond what any whiplash could erase. For Benedita, the hours were measured by small secret movements. While others counseled caution, she and a few others worked quietly to ready a way out. Joachim, called Mano by the rivermen, had been spoken of like a rumor long before he came in flesh. He was not a man of the house. He belonged to the river and to the barter that rivers make with men who needed a hand. Leathered and soft-mouthed, he had once ferrying the colonel's timber, and later earned pennies for guiding people through the reeds at night. To some he owed small favors, to others his name suggested danger. Benedita had not known him well. She had seen him once from the veranda, a dark presence standing where the mangroves bent the river's face. When the idea of leaving hardened into necessity, a woman of the Senzala had found the words to ask him, and he had come with a face like an unfastened boat. He listened to the story as one listens to a complaint that might be weather. He did not ask for gold. He asked for secrecy and a favor to be called in later. "The river calls for its payment differently," he said once, flipping a rope coil with a hand softened by years in water. His eyes had a way of making talk into a ledger you could not read without losing something. He promised a crossing, silent, at a time when the patrols were least likely to be on the lookout. But he also warned, crossings were not metaphors. The river takes and holds. It exacts a weight. They made plans to go the following week. Benedita gave into each arrangement with a small, careful agreement that only those who had been part of the smear would know. A route through reeds, a raft hidden in the bulrushes, a boy paid to leave a lantern by the south bend. The women worked to make sure that if all went wrong, there would be plausible lies to tell. They bartered bread and hidden coins. They smoothed the story like cloth until it looked like an ordinary life. The risk sharpened their faces into determined outlines. On the evening chosen, the patio breathed a different air. Not the hush of the midday scheme, but the taut quiet of escape, the sort of silence that thrums with the footfalls of fear. The moon rode small and hard in the sky, a polished coin in the dark. Benedita wrapped herself in a shawl, its color faded by labor, and took with her a small bundle. Some clothes, a cloth-wrapped loaf, a scrap of family photo pressed between linen, a thing for the memory more than the eyes. Closia came as far as the outer edge and folded Benedita's hands in a way that meant farewell and equipment both. Maria pressed a piece of brass into Benedita's palm and then shoved it back, a coin you could hide in a seam to pay for a raft or a bribe. Isabel's face was hard where it might have been soft. They spoke little, their mouths had learned to hold contingency like a recipe. Joachim waited where the land turned to read. He was darker than the night around him, but his gestures were as readable as a compass. He moved with the calm of someone who had spent many nights conversing with currents. The raft was small, a thing made of old planks and a couple of oars tied with rope. Benedita climbed on, and the water yawned at her feet like a promise and a threat. They did not row fast. Speed in such an escape is an advertisement. They let river and reeds carry them, gliding as if they were someone else's story being told in a slow voice. The mud smelled of root and the river's breath. Night animals sounded like small infringements. The distant bark of a dog, the rustle of something in the grass, the call of an owl with a voice that says nothing about who is right. Benedita felt each sound as if it were an assessor of her decision. The river wrapped them. They passed under willows that let their branches touch the water like an apology. Joachim's knowledge was not only of channels, but of timing. He steered toward a place known to a few, a shallow that, at low tide, bared a path of mud and stones. At high tide, it was a gentle current into open water. He had mapped nights by the cloud and by the moon's appetite. He watched the sky and the bank, and when a far light glinted, men with torches sweeping the edges of the shore, he whispered, and they lay low within the reeds. Such holds were tense, small miracles of patience. Benedita held her breath so long that the air, both with and without sound, felt like an indulgence. Once, when the raft scraped against a shelf of silt, Benedita thought she had heard shouts. Her heart trembled. Joachim smiled a smile that was not a comfort but a fact. "The river holds secrets if you keep your feet quiet," he said, and in his voice there was no condemnation, only the admission of a cost. They passed a bend and came upon a line of lights beyond a low headland, searchers circling like fishers with bright hooks. For a long stretch there was nothing to do but let the water take them, and pray the wind did not change. In those hours, Benedita felt an odd combination of elation and a hollow that was not the same as fear. Elation, because the arc of her arm had made the mistress cry, and the ripple of that act had already reached beyond that day. A hollow because leaving was a form of erasure, abandonment of faces who had stitched her wounds and of those who had been left to bear the house's response. She wept once without sound, a small moistness that washed her face and seemed ridiculous in the dark. Joachim offered no words of consolation. His hands continued to steer. The river took the tears and did not return them. They reached the far bank before dawn, landing with the soft clonk of wood on mud. On the other side stood not the wide freedom of a city, but a small strip of scrub, and a hidden path that would, if all went as planned, lead to a safe house on the far side of a tributary. Joachim had friends there, people who owed him or perhaps expected payment. He left Benedita with a woman named Anna, who smelled faintly of smoke and who had eyes that had seen much. Anna gave Benedita a bit of garlicky stew and a warm blanket, and told her nothing that was a promise. Night had made her friendlier than the day. She did not ask how old Benedita was, or whether she had children. She only offered a bed and a plan. The escape in flesh had been accomplished. The escape in story was only beginning. That night in the safe house, Benedita could not sleep. She thought of the faces in the Kenzala and the cart that had taken some away. She wondered if Maria had been spared, if Isabel's scullion days would allow a secret smile when the mistress passed, if Lucia would be left to handle horses that smelled of humiliation. The river had carried her from one house into a tenuous shelter. It had not given judgment or absolution. Word travels unevenly. Within days, the plantation's official tale hardened. Men were arrested for complicity, a few were let go, several servants were punished for lack of vigilance. Tomas had been given license to interrogate more freely, in hopes that panic would make others confess. The colonel, appearing once more at the veranda to ease gossip, declared the matter resolved. in the blunt speech of those who would rather be thought decisive than mistaken. But the house's true state was read in smaller ways. The mistress began to keep to rooms where hands must be invited. She wore shawls to hide the wet spot that had once been a story. She stopped arranging flowers with the same careless joy, and instead sent for attendants with eyes that sought the seams for evidence. Vanity took a new space, less the polished reflection of power, more the fear of being seen cracked. For some in the senzala, the price was immediate. Men came from neighboring lands, mercenaries who made a wage in fear, seeking those who had carried messages, those who had watched for horses. They dragged men from beds at night and took them across river bends in the dark. Hairboy, who had been paid to leave the lantern, was found in the field the next day with his ears ringing and his face marked for a slander. Lucia received a beating that was not described in detail, but that left her hands smaller and her work more deliberate. Maria was held for a week under suspicion and then returned with a changed manner towards Smiles, as if laughter had become another person's property. Isabel, the broom woman, was given to the colonel's pantry where no one looked for joy. These were facts that adjusted the texture of the senzala. Their lives tightened as if by a hand in the seams. People spoke of mancadas, of deals made quietly. Some men had been paid in coin to swear they had seen Benedita leave on her own accord. Others had been threatened with losing the small freedoms they had beyond the plantation's walls. The law, which could be summoned to the house with a slip of paper, would only do so much. It did not so much enforce justice as quiet things into a record that could be shown as proof much later. The consequences were real in ways that left bruises invisible. Outside the plantation, in the villages and in the neighboring fields, the story shifted into versions you could tell quickly at a well or a market stall. In one telling, Benedita had been seen running down the riverbank with a child in her arms. In another, she had been taken in by a quilombo, escaped and welcomed and married and living well. In yet another version, she had been caught on the far side, recaptured and sold on the coast. These made plausible stories. Each had the grain of possibility. People picked the version that fit the way they wanted to imagine a world. Some wanted hope, others wanted caution. The story became less about what had actually happened and more about what people needed the event to say. Months turned into seasons. The house went on in its ways. The colonel's ledger filled with accounts. Donna Constanza continued to arrange her rooms with the precision of someone rewriting a memory into protocol. Tomas walked the patio with a reclaimed stiffness. Still, threads of change unwound slowly. The panic that had followed the scream left a trace. Servants were less likely to speak during supper, to play childish games in the corners. They watched one another as if surveilling complicity. The mistress had lost some of her invulnerability, and power had been proven porous. That alone became a kind of seed. Back with Joachim, who continued his work as river guide and occasional courier, there were the small returns of favors. He would occasionally for a coin row out with goods to a safe house and come back with rumor and gossip. Once he brought word, soft at first the way gossip is when it lives among reeds, that a woman had been seen beyond a bend in a market town wearing a red cloth around her head in a way that made people look twice. She looked like a ghost, Joachim said, or like a woman who had learned how to breathe air that did not expect her to be small. Benedita was not named, and no one agreed whether the woman was the same. Still, the image did what images do. It lodged into people's hearts and found purchase in mouths. Years alter most things. Memory reshapes like a river that smooths stones. The scream, which had once been as sharp as a blade, became a syllable in the house's story. Less a wound made new each time and more a mark on a map. In the senzala, women who had been girls when the water spilled began to tell the story differently. It became quieter in some accounts, a cautionary tale of the river and its appetite. In others it became a hymn, an unlikely song for the small kindness of someone who would not lower her head. Children at chores learned to say the phrase as an incantation of steadiness. Never lower your head. It was taught not as a boast but as a way to keep the jaw from bending under a public humiliation. The phrase traveled like a small coin from mouth to mouth. These retellings performed a work that was both small and grand. They turned contingency into legend. Benedita's name, when it was used, moved like a touchstone, sometimes spoken with pride, sometimes with a warning. People embroidered the event in ways that made it fit their courage or their fear, like a woman adding a stitch to a hem. For some families, telling the story was an act of comfort. For others, it was a measure of caution. The more it circulated, the more the event lost the immediate shape of a person and gained the larger shape of a possibility, that someone could take a risk and that risk would be known. Not all the stories were kind. There were tales that hung on an edge of moralizing. Do not throw stones at those who govern, obey or come to ruin. The house wanted such tales. The mistress herself took to telling visitors about the dangers of disorder and the need for clear lines. Her speeches acquired a tremor but also a new intensity. The colonel signed letters and made trips to other properties, where he seemed more brisk and less given to smiles. Yet rumor has a way of finding a place to live, even when a master attempts to rewrite it. Where the mistress sought to close the wound with legalities and threats, the servants mended with memory. There were two quieter versions that spoke of Benedita's fate in ways that protected those left behind. A neighbor would say the river had taken her gently and set her down in a place where she learned to plant yams and to laugh. Another would say she was taken to a town where she hid among people who spoke different tongues and that she perhaps married and bore children. Still another would insist she had returned to the plantation some day later and, in the hush of a night, brushed a broom near a sleeping child and whispered the phrase into a small ear, "Never lower your head." The contradictions allowed people to keep hope alive while also keeping fear honest. The price paid by the conspirators could not be erased by narrative. Maria, for long, could not step into the porch without a hand near her throat, where she had been choked during an interrogation. Isabel's life in the pantry became a long, slow lesson in invisibility. She learned to make bread that tasted like the anointing of quiet. Lucia, whose hands had guided Benedita through stitches, was one winter sold or perhaps hired out to another plantation. People could not agree, and the ambiguity held a new cruelty. Sometimes being taken was being sold. Sometimes it was being moved. Each woman's life had shifted with a different geography of pain. The cost was recorded not in the ledger, but in the ways mothers taught children to hold themselves when a mistress walked by. As for Benedita, the thread of her outward life remained by design uncertain. There were people who later claimed, with the authority of those who like certainty, that she had reached a quilombo and lived a long life of relative peace. Others insisted she fell sick beyond the river and died under a sky that did not know the house's rules. Joachim, who had taken a compass point on her crossing and turned it into the habits of a man who had known her name, would sometimes say nothing and sometimes remark that rivers do not forget the weight of people. He would often smile at the mention of her and then make himself a cup of coffee and return to looking at the water. Those who owed him a favor believed him when he made the casual remark that she had been seen with a baby or that she had been passed on as a rumor in a market town. But nothing in the accounts could be treated as proof. The fate of a person who slipped beyond jurisdiction often becomes a small, contested archive, stories that comfort some and bedevil others. Time, that steady eraser and preserver, turned the event into a thing people used. Politicians and men of property told the story as a warning of what unrest could do. Mothers told it as a lesson in keeping a head lifted when insult comes. Some printed versions softened the edges into morality plays. Some songs made it into a refrain and added little embroidered lines that bore no resemblance to the original detail. The scream survived in the shape of a sound that was no longer only a person's. It had become a symbol of a moment where the house's architecture of power failed to hold its own design. Through all of this, the patio changed not in outward architecture, but in what people felt while they stood between the house and the senzala. Where commands had once had the absolute cadence of law, there was now a slackness, a place where voices, if low, could hold another tone. The mistress, for all her arrangements, had discovered a fragility she had not wished to learn, that what is polished can be cracked by water and by noise. The colonel, whether he admitted it or not, had learned to count measures of rumor as part of governance. Tomas kept to his roles and tightened his vigil, but the edge of his confidence wore thin in private. Power, which often performs itself in spectacle, had been shown to be performative. Years later, around a brazier in the dusk of a new kitchen, A young woman who had been a child at the time of the water's throwing asked her grandmother about Benedita. "Did she make the mistress scream?" she asked, with the simple and direct curiosity of children who like their stories clear. The grandmother, Maria if she had been spared or another who had heard it, threw her head back and laughed a laugh that was more a little sob. "She did," she said, and then gave the caution that often follows the telling of a memory. "But she paid. All acts have a coin," the girl persisted. "Did she live?" The woman looked at the coals and then at the child and said what people have said for as long as memory is useful. Some say so, some say not. The thing that does not lie is that she would not lower her head. She said the phrase, and the rasp of the brazier swallowed the rest. The mantra settled into the younger woman's mouth like a seed. In the end there was no tidy justice. There never is in such places. There was instead a string of consequences that laced through the lives of many. Someone paid with exile, someone with injury, someone with daily humiliation, and someone, perhaps, with freedom that will never be verified. The scream had altered calendars, had become a syllable with multiple inflections, and had made a woman's act an incitement for talk, for rumor, for song. For those who had stood and watched, for those who had thrown and for those who had borne, the world was not the same. In the more sentimental versions, Benedita's courage becomes a beacon that helps others to small acts of defiance. A woman who opens a window and lets air into a room that had been kept closed. A child who looks a master in the eye and does not flinch. In the more cynical tellings, she is a warning. Bravery can be costlier than silence. Both are truths, and neither is sufficient. The patio has its own memory. Paintings could try to capture the glare of noon, but none can enshrine the exact timbre of a scream or the way a whip cuts the air into rules. Sound, being ephemeral, does the strange work of either being buried and then unearthed or being preserved in the cadence of stories told at dusk. It is in those stories that the phrase returns, again and again like a knot in a rope. Never lower your head. It is said as counsel, as an invocation of dignity, as a way to make a small private revolution in posture. Sometimes when storms come and the house's verandas leak, an old woman will stand and imagine the day by pace, the shine of a tankard, the slap that teaches, the whip that readjusts a body, the water that fell back onto a mistress's shoulder. She says softly, "Never lower your head." And in saying it, she pulls the room toward an impossible comfort, the conviction that endurance and defiance are not the same, but that they both have worth. Children, who later will have their own choices, hear the line and tuck it under the blade of their day. What remains certain is not the final fate of one woman, but the rupture she made in the house's accounting of itself. The mistress's scream, etched into the air that had once only held orders, became a kind of test, of whose voices could be heard, of what a body could refuse, of what a community would pay to keep itself whole. The cost could be tallied in small losses. The seed might grow in ways that no ledger could calculate. Years from that noon, when the sun once more sits like a coin over the tiles, a child may spill water by accident and expect the same old whip of a voice to fall. Instead, a woman, older, with hands like the patio's memory, might catch the basin and, leaning toward the child, say the phrase that had been a map through history. "Never lower your head," she will say, and in the simple act of speaking it, she passes on a thing that cost someone dearly. The phrase carries weight because it is not a slogan but a remnant of a moment where a sound changed people's expectations and where dignity, frail, expensive dignity, was chosen in full knowledge of the price. If this story moved you, share it. Let the memory travel. Never lower your head.